involves me being really transparent and really open. And I had this fear of just them like turning it around on me and like it just going completely wrong and like using it against me, or just like my biggest fear was them not caring, just like shutting me down. And then also like me thinking, well, if that happens, like how am I supposed to avoid it? And how am I supposed to know that that's going to happen?
Again. And there was a question in there somewhere.
Yeah. So, what if my vulnerability bites me in the butt?
Oh yes, that one. Yes, you guys all hear that? What if your vulnerability bites you in the butt? And my response was, did you read it?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I just read it.
Oh, you just read it, yeah. Well, the short answer is it will. That sounds comforting, doesn't it, Justin? Nobody is safe today. No, it will. The issue isn't so much whether somebody responds or not. The issue is whether I'm being vulnerable or not. And I think I had a pretty long response. I apologize for that. But you guys get subject to my Sunday evening rants because I'm reading all of your journals before I come in here. So there's plenty to go around. I guess my point was, it's ironic, I think, particularly since we're talking about this in the groups and in class and stuff, is that whenever something goes wrong, we always blame vulnerability for it, instead of blaming the context, the person, other things for it. Because vulnerability is rarely wrong. Now, if it's done with somebody who's unsafe, that's just dumb. It's not wrong, because we'll talk about that in a minute. But the reality is vulnerability always grows us. It always does. So is it going to go wrong? Yeah, probably, because I won't know, the person that I think I know, what they're bringing into the situation to talk to me. So I can't really know that, even if they're a safe person. Because we've already talked about this, that not everybody is safe all the time. People can have just a piss poor day out there and then come into a conversation with you and be in this kick the dog syndrome, and you're the dog and you're being vulnerable, and then suddenly everything goes to hell in a handbasket. So the vulnerability, our tendency is, because we don't like being vulnerable, we blame the vulnerability instead of some other factors that a lot of times we just don't know. And I think even if it does blow up, I think I still gain something out of that. Because I've found, and that's what Brene Brown talks about when she talks about ordinary courage. It takes courage to do something that doesn't quite work. But then you what's the title of the book? Daring Greatly. And it's daring to do something that I know is good for me, even though I won't get the desired result. So it was a really good question. You got more than you probably bargained for in my answer, but that's okay. Other things? Yeah.
How do you, so if someone that you're not very close with, you've met them recently, but they're pouring out their life to you, and you're just how do you politely say I don't want to hear it? But not in a rude way. How do you extend grace when you know it's a toxic either friendship or something like that?
The person sharing with you
Yeah.
is in the toxic relationship with you?
No, just if it's I don't know, I know this girl and she just literally gave she gave me her whole life story. And
Right.
I was I don't even know you, I
Mhm.
don't know, but then clearly she needed to talk about it kind of thing. So I'm trying to find the balance in that.
Well, I'm not sure that you're going to, if somebody's going to perceive you as trustworthy enough to share the whole life story, I think you probably should have a back thought back here. This is oversharing.
Yeah.
And create kind of the boundaries you need so that you don't absorb all this stuff that's coming at you. On the flip side, if there's a follow-up conversation, I think we can make kind of an observation about it, to them, in terms of, wow, it seemed like there was a lot of stuff going on with you last time, and it seemed like a lot to me too. And that's an accurate observation, and at the same time it communicates to the other person that you've actually noted how much is coming out of them. And at some point, if it continues, then you might have to say, time out, maybe we can consider finding you somebody you can talk to, because I'm not equipped to handle this stuff. And that's we oftentimes will not set limits because we're afraid, boundaries, because we're afraid the other person will get offended or hurt, and they might. But that doesn't remove the need for boundaries, because you're helping them own themselves when you do that. So, any other questions or anything? Yeah.
What do you think the relationship is of worthiness and then entitlements?
What do you think it is?
Well, I was talking with a friend for a while about it. We talked just a lot about things in this class, but just of this like concept of like we have to believe we're worthy because we're humans and we have worth.
Mm-hmm.
So like it comes from that, but then it's like I'm worthy to have a friend. Well, like I'm not entitled to have a friend.
Right.
You know, so like what is that?
Where's the line in there? Well, and I think there's a grandiose sense of self-worth that brings about entitlement. That I'm worth. I have an inflated sense of my worth, and therefore I'm entitled to whatever I want. So, I think sometimes we end up having to live in this gray area between, I do have worth. A lot of times we connect worthiness with performance, and we connect worth with value. And that's a pretty fine line, really. I think generally speaking, most people say, I have worth, therefore I'm worthy. I would also probably add into that worthy tends to be other determined rather than my determining it. So the other person sees that worth and calls me worthy in a sense to have a relationship. But entitlement usually is always about rights and what I have a right to. And more often than not, it ends up becoming, it ends up becoming a way to justify rolling over people's boundaries. And because I don't want to accept no for an answer, and then we're into the world of controllers and all that. So, I think we can say, well, the big T truth is, I do have worth, and God has proclaimed me worthy of His love. I got that. But then there's a little T reality internally to me as to what I deem as what makes me worthy, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that today when we continue to look at the people that are most susceptible to shame and how that sets up. But it's usually I think, as a general rule, it ends up being kind of an inflated sense of self-worth. So, yeah.
I was going to say, kind of with your last statement, that entitlement seems to be the result of not understanding worthiness.
That's probably true. Yeah.
And then pride also seems to have a relationship with insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
Just like back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
No set security in worthiness.
Yeah, well, and pride in a sense is kind of the substitute for a lack of sense of worth with other people. I think sometimes we'll do that, is we'll just compensate. So I'll get very prideful, but I think all of those things are kind of mashed up together in a lot of ways. Insecurity oftentimes ends up being a pretty major engine. What we're talking about in this class with shame, I think probably is the fuel for that engine, if you look at it. So, thinking of somebody that can actually live graciously with themselves is somebody who's reasonably secure, and so they're they're not necessarily under attack, if you will, by other people's opinions or approval or lack thereof, and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, I think they're a lot of times all tied up together. So, any other questions or anything? Okay, well, what I want to try to finish we finished with, no, I'll pray here in a minute, but we finished with the idea of the candidates for shame. That primarily was involved. The issue of candidates for shame means essentially the people that are susceptible to shame, and how we're going to look at it and understand it. We covered this last time, but I wanted to just go ahead and review it real quick. But before I do, let me pray, and then we'll get into this. Father, guide and direct our time and this time we spend. I pray that as we talk about some of these things that make us susceptible to hearing the voice of shame, that we can find a way to resist it and find a way to fight it and not get caught. There hardly is any of these that we're going to look at today that any of us have some familiarity with or sense of connection to, and it would be very easy for a talk like this to just sink us deeper and deeper into the very thing we're trying to resist. So help us to hang on to grace and allow that to give us the space to learn and to evaluate, and then also just to engage relationships in a little bit different way. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we ended on this one. We looked at the ideas here of the sense of being overly responsible, having the sense of responsibility for anybody that's in my sphere of influence. Then somehow I've got, if something goes wrong with them, then something's going wrong with me. And ultimately, when we're talking about this, everybody, if you really, this is extreme, but at some level, everybody that I'm in connection with, whether it's doing a job or getting a test out or whatever, if something goes wrong, that's a reflection on me, which then fuels our need to control things, because I don't want it to turn out badly. Because if it turns out badly, then what? I'm bad. So it drives along a lot of unhealthy behavior, needless to say. So the overly responsible is another part of this category. We talked a little bit about how too muchness is that there's just too much in the world to be responsible for. We weren't talking about the factor of me being too much. And the whole idea of what I've said before, and we'll talk some more about, is that control and trust cannot coexist. So if I don't trust God and what goes on, then the only thing left for me is to control everything and everyone in my sphere of influence. And that's what overly responsible people oftentimes fall into. It's a sense of in their mind being committed and helpful and in a sense kind of helping other people be responsible. But the thing is I'm not empowering somebody. I'm being responsible for them. And that's when we have to have this discussion about the difference of the prepositions that we talked about during the boundaries stuff. Being responsible to somebody is empowering. Being responsible for somebody is enabling. And it usually how that tends to work its way out. So moving on, the next one is the obsessive moralizers. Obsessive moralizers see everything in black and white, right or wrong, like I mentioned just a minute ago. Is this a right thing to do? Well, whether I eat chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream is not a moral issue. It's a preference issue. And we can fall into dividing the entire world into black and white, right and wrong. Is there moral right things? Of course there is. But just because there is that doesn't mean everything is, because the moment that happens, then I can't enjoy the things that God has actually placed in my life because they're right or wrong somehow. And the funny thing about it is the wrongness of those things are oftentimes in the service of shame. It's wrong for me to feel happy. It's wrong for me to have good things happen because I don't deserve them. Well, there's that one coming too. So the whole idea here comes down to what is on a moral plane. I have explained this to more people than I can count anymore about not everything is on a moral plane. And whether I like to drive a particular way or whatever team I like or don't like or whatever, it's not a moral issue. And the broader we make the world that way into right and wrong, the harder it is to resist shame. Because generally a lot of things are wrong. We don't have to look very far to find that. So what happens with these people is they feel the same as when they violate a convention or an expectation or disappoint somebody, they feel the same as if they have violated their own conscience. And what does that mean? I mean, think about the implications of that. What it means is I'm constantly in a state of shame because I never do anything right? And usually when we cast our behavior in that way, in an imperative, absolutistic way, I'm always going to be in the wrong. And if I'm always in the wrong, I'll never get anything right. So obsessive moralizers tend to see the world in very black and white terms, and by doing so, it makes it impossible to really just engage something. And the worst part about it is that a lot of this is driven by the opposite. Okay, so the obsessiveness of this. I mean, the word is, I think, significant because obsessiveness is about anxiety. Obsessive and compulsive behaviors are always about anxiety. They bind anxiety. It gives me something to do so I don't feel quite so anxious. So what does that tell you about the people that are moralizers? It's about anxiety. It's not about morality. And so they do things to avoid being wrong. That's what drives their behavior instead of choosing the good, the noble, the pure, the truthful. You guys know the list I'm talking about. And so when I spend all of my time avoiding something, all right, the bad, it doesn't really matter what direction I take. But if I'm pursuing something, it does matter what direction I take. But when I'm avoiding, it doesn't. And obsessive moralizers are oftentimes in that category. Here's another one. The compulsive comparers. Now, it's not insignificant that we had obsessive moralizers and compulsive comparers. Because again, we're talking about anxiety. So they're constantly comparing themselves to somebody more successful than them. Well, guess what? There's always at least one. There's always at least one. Rarely do we make comparisons with people that are at the same skill level as us or below. Rarely will we do that for one main reason. I want to motivate myself. I want to be like Mike. And so the funny thing about it is that the minute that they come into contact or into orbit of somebody who's more successful, it is only a reminder of their own failure. And a lot of this comes out of what I mentioned here is the heart of envy. Because envy defines good as what I do not have and hates what I do. And so we make the comparison and we always lose. And the world is safe because it's always predictable in that way. And compulsive comparers are that way. You can find it virtually anywhere in anything people talk about, whether it's how they look or how they dress or anything else. There is always a comparison lurking somewhere. I have a very good friend. He came on the retreat this past fall, Brian Harden. He's the voice of the Daily Audio Bible, and he made this comment. about, when we look at what we feel and how we feel, it's nothing compared to, and he had named a group of people in Syria that were under persecution as Christians. Well, yeah, that's true. That is true if we want to make that comparison. Because the funny thing about it is the minute we compare, we cease to do anything about it. A lot of times it doesn't take us down the route of resolution. It just simply makes us feel bad enough, and then we feel bad, and presumably that's the end of the story. So there's a lot about this that probably kicks all of us in the backside because we do this. I had this happen. I actually had this happen at the beginning of the school year. And I basically went right into a shame spiral that was second to none. And I shut my door in my office and made sure that I talked to absolutely no one because I felt like such a unmitigated failure in trying to write a book. And the person that was celebrating in our hallways was celebrating getting a book contract. And I said, this is ridiculous. I'm done. I'm just done. And that's a lot of times my response. It's just I tap out. I don't tap out very long, but I tap out. And sooner or later, somebody notices. An annoying friend of mine by the name of Saxby. He comes knocking on my door, and he says, why is your door shut? I said, I want it shut. Get the hell out of my face. and of course, he stayed. That's what friends do. He said, what's going on? And I told him. And he told me, which he's really good at, and he's going to be watching this, so this is perfect. And I've chided about this. I'm not talking out of school because he's heard me talk about this before. He is really good with big T truth, really good. And he tried that first, and I said, I don't care. And then he said, well, what are you going to do? I go, oh, now we got an interesting question. Because it's like, I'm going to stay here. I don't care what you say. And then suddenly I start listening to myself and thinking, you're an idiot. No shame there, of course. But I was already in it, so who cares? And and then the worst part about it in a lot of cases is both of the friends of mine that are like this look at me and say, is that what you really believe? So it wasn't about what he could tell me. It was more about what I believe to be true. And I keep having to remind myself that for every semester that I teach, I have about 30 more books I write. And I need to be reminded of that. It's really easy, but I got attacked by this very same thing. It happens to all of us. And it's not so much whether it happens, it's how long we stay there. And I had planned to set the world record, but that got ruined. So, but this one is one of the biggest challenges for me, is envy. Because I see other people's success as a reflection of my failure. And if we're in an academic environment, a lot of us do. Because it's always a reflection. And it's a reflection that we always lose on. So, compulsive comparers. Next one, if you're not uncomfortable enough yet. Approval addicts. They cannot approve of themselves unless there's enough people who approve of them. Which means if I get one person to approve of me, I need 4. And if I get 4 people to approve of me, I need 400. And if I need 400, I need 4,000. And the funny thing about it is that bar always rises upward. Which means that if I never get above the bar to say that I'm approved of, what does that mean? Yes, I'm asking you. What does that mean? What's below here? I'm not ever approved of. If the bar is always rising and you say, well, if I get above that, then I'm okay. But the minute I get close, that bar goes up again. I said, wait a minute. If I get there, and there, and there, and I am forever in a state of disapproval because the bar is always rising. So the other thing about this oftentimes for folks that are caught in this trap is they are always fishing for approval. Now, I don't mean literally that, but it's more a matter of parsing and looking at words and what people say and how they say it in terms of whether I'm approved of or not. You can call it trolling. But it's always in terms of them. It's always in terms of them. And you can say, well, that's a sinful pattern. Yeah, good. I'm glad we got that nailed down. What is it about? Well, ultimately, it's about the fundamental assumption is that I am flawed, and I am so flawed that I will never be acceptable. So I will settle for, instead of acceptance, I'll settle for approval, which I'll never get. So as a general rule, the absence of approval means disapproval. It's a little bit like the absence of a response to a text message means that they hate you. So it's a very, everything is measured in terms of that. And it's one of the hardest things, I think, being in relationships with folks that struggle with this issue, because you know that if you give them feedback, they will sink into shame. You know it, and you know it so well that you don't say it. And that's good and bad. Because on the upside, you say, well, at least I'm preserving them from feeling too bad. And there's the side of me that would say, who died and left you in charge of their feelings? That doesn't mean you have to be insensitive and rude. I am not saying that. But if you know your friend that well, you might actually pre-qualify what you're about to say and help them stay above the waterline with shame. Say, look, I know this could really sound awful, and you could end up hating yourself over this. And all I'm asking is that you try not to do it this time. That's not what my intent is. Let me help you see what I'm trying to tell you. Because if you want to really anchor it all, Proverbs makes it very clear that the wounds of a friend are to be trusted, which means I've got to help people see that I'm their friend. I don't care how long you've been, quote unquote, friends. In that moment in time, they need help seeing that you're their ally and friend, not their adversary, just because you're carrying bad news. The key is staying put, which probably most of you do as a friend. You give somebody feedback, it's not a hit and run. You give them feedback and you stay put. The challenge is for them to see that you're still there. One of the biggest things that I've seen happen in groups a lot is people have already catastrophized what the other members of the group are going to do with something they say. And one of the first things I will say oftentimes is I will say, look around. Are the people doing what you expected them to? Because we don't take in the data after that. The shame has so overwhelmed us that we don't take in the data to see that people are looking at us with compassion and care, and they're interested, and they're not getting up and running out of the room in terror because you're such an awful person. But we have to see it. And sometimes we need friends to help us see it, because we may not, and we may not on the first try either. That's the worst part. It's like we don't get it right the first time, and then I sink into more shame because of how shameful I am, and now I'm really stuck. But good friends hang in. It's just like Brene Brown says about showing up. Good friends just show up. So, here's another one. The never deserving, another favorite of mine. I've had a lot of people. I'll tell you a story of in a minute. But we don't feel that we deserve anything good. And a lot of times we look at our history and say, see, there, therefore, I guess I just don't deserve anything good. And then we make really bad choices oftentimes about the people and the discernment we exercise or don't with people. So they tend to sabotage the good because of this belief. And what does sabotaging the good look like? Let me tell you this story first. My eldest daughter has been through some really crappy relationships. Really bad ones, abusive ones. Unfortunately, God in his exquisite redemptive way used one of the most abusive of her relationships for her to be pregnant and have a little girl out of wedlock. That was one of the most difficult things for all of our family to go through with her. That's just a nature of that. And she looked at that point in time when her daughter was adopted by another family, and she said, this proves it. I can't keep my own daughter. I don't deserve anything good. And she kept on. And all of her choices of guys after that lived that out. Until one guy came into her life. They were working together at a store at Starbucks. And my third oldest daughter prides herself in being the matchmaker. And she said, you need to meet this guy. One of those sorts of things. And they started dating and getting to know one another, and things were going really pretty well. And she and I had a conversation probably 6 months into this relationship. And she said, why is it that I always pick a fight with him? And I said, because you don't believe you deserve anything good. And you're sabotaging the good. And she knew that, but right at that point in time, she needed to be reminded of that. And she still has that temptation today. She's married in January 11th, and we had this conversation over the weekend again about it. Because when her husband now treats her with kindness and respect and joy about the things she's achieving and everything else, she just looks kind of askance at times because she's not so sure that that's what she deserves. Because deserving is about performance. Deserving is about performance. Will we ever perform good enough to deserve anything? Well, in the ultimate spiritual sense, no, that's exactly why Jesus came. But then we still have this gift that we are given, and we say, yeah, but let me earn it. Let me do something to get it back. So, in a lot of cases, the relationships and things the person gets kind of pulled into is what I call the Messiah complex. It seems like all the misfit persons and other people they get drawn to. Why? Because if they just save one more, then they'll finally deserve something. Again, the bar's changing and always moving. So, there is never deserving. There's another one. People that are condemned by the memories of their past. This one is equally as difficult. Because in a lot of cases, in a lot of ways, we seem to be trying to drive our car forward by looking in the rearview mirror. So, the reality is everybody's got regrets. The question is whether or not I'm going to make my present day decisions built on what is good for me now or what I did back then. Which takes us back into sabotaging good, takes us back into a lot of the other things. So in a lot of cases, the situations and that they get into and relationships they get into is always an offset for what they did wrong before. There's always an offset. So what does that mean? It means that their behavior and the choices they make are never intentionally made. the behavior and choices that are made are always in reaction to whatever I did wrong last time. And sometimes those have really long roots and long shadows, what we've done in the past. But being kind of dogged by the memories of the past are always going to be something that sets us up for more shame. It'd be just like a referee, and sometimes we see referees do this, that have made a patently bad call. And a few plays later, they make a call in favor of the other team. They adjust their call according to the bad call that they made before. And in a lot of cases, that's how people live their lives. It's like, I blew it back then. Well, I've got to do the opposite, which oftentimes ends up being an error in the opposite direction. So, condemned by the memories of our past. Another one that we have to look at is discounting our positives. See, a lot of times people think discounting our positives is the same as humility. And sometimes it isn't. Because in a lot of cases, humility has a very different foundation than discounting the things that I do well. Some of you wrote about something that Saxby did in your group, and I couldn't help but chuckle. When he asked you if you wanted to share what you were proud of. Yeah, that response right there was in a variety of journals. And I think I had a conversation via notes to say the assumption is that if I speak of something I'm proud, therefore I am now prideful. And we really do believe that. I think we've gotten drilled with that in the church to such a degree that to be proud of ourselves, of the things that we've accomplished and set out to do, that somehow it makes us prideful. So the only reasonable thing to do is to discount all the positives I do, just so I can stay away from being prideful. Again, I would remind you, it's an error in the opposite direction. Emphasis on error. So when we hear a compliment, nobody ever has this problem, right? We find a way to dodge it. We find a way to discount it. After all, they're just being nice. Or they should say that. They're Christians. Yes?
In our culture, wouldn't it be kind of rude to not, like when someone compliments, like, my shirt,
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, you don't say, like, oh, thank you, I love it too, you know, you say, like, oh, I got it for $5, like, you do kind of, like,
Yeah.
discount the compliment.
So what would happen if you said thank you? What's the worst thing that could happen?
I guess it wouldn't be horrible.
Say what?
I guess it wouldn't be horrible, but...
Oh,
like,
now you're just being accommodating, Sophia. Because the reality is I mean, somebody comes up and pastors have this a lot, you know, and I get a little annoyed because somebody comes up and says, "I love your sermon," I have two responses. Okay, one is thanks, I appreciate that, and secondly, why did you like it? Because if they can't prove it, then then it's just an empty compliment anyway. See how we do that? Yeah.
Do you think there's also like a link to like you don't want to feel prideful, so like you're complimenting them back, even if like you're not saying you don't mean it, but you're not like where it's like, oh thanks, like I like your outfit, oh thanks, I like yours too, and just
Yeah, I mean
that's like
it's
a common phrase you always hear.
it's always a diversion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's such an awkward silence at the end. Thank you, I really appreciate that. Period. I'm gonna explode. And it's hard. Yes, ma'am.
Wait, so are you saying what your other response would be besides thank you? Like, why did you like it? Is that wrong to ask?
Well, I mean,
Because you kind of like, I just,
well, it turns into a cross interrogation, right?
I mean, you're not asking what part of it, like, what scripture is it?
No. But
I feel like that's wrong.
well, I'm not saying it is. I think sometimes it's what happens, even in some arguments people have with each other, is that somebody will say something nice and the other person will say, so why do you think that? The person says, I don't know, I just liked it. And it's like, well, that ain't good enough.
Well, what's wrong with that?
Well, because essentially, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to diminish. Well, I don't think it's just curiosity. Color me a little skeptical on that.
Shallow. Like if someone compliments me and it like actually seems shallow, I'll be like, oh, why? What's wrong with asking why?
Because usually there's a hidden agenda behind it, and the agenda is to find a way to discount what somebody's saying. So I think I told this story in the group. I told it in my group, the Teddy Roosevelt story. Did I tell you?
Yes.
Have you guys heard this before, the Teddy Roosevelt story? He was in a receiving line as president, and he wanted to know how many people actually listened to him. So he stood in the receiving line, people walked by, and he would shake their hand and he'd say, I killed my mother-in-law last night. And some people would say, well, that's nice, Mr. President, and keep right on moving. It's like, all sorts of people would just kind of, whatever, it's like, oh, good. And keep right on moving. And finally, there's one person that shakes his hand and he says, I killed my mother-in-law last night. And the person leans in next to his ear and he said, I'm sure she deserved it. Finally, there was somebody who listened. Finally, there was somebody who listened. So, I think in a lot of cases, pastors are oftentimes bombarded with amorphous, ambiguous compliments that, quite honestly, get a little tiring to listen to. And you take them as intended, and that is, they're not intended to be mean or anything like that. And generally, most people are not. It's not like they're sitting in the rows taking notes about what you say. So, it's fine. It is fine. I rarely would ever ask why, because unless there are some that come up fully intending to tell you why and tell you all the things you should have included in it too. So, there's all of those kind of backdrops that are part of that. So I'm not implying it's necessarily a bad thing to do. It's just in a lot of cases there's a hidden agenda underneath, and that's what we're talking about here. So, okay, how are we doing? You hanging in? Okay, no, not quite. All right, here's another one. So instead of discounting our positives, we just simply magnify our flaws.
How many are these?
13.
What number are we on?
I don't know. I don't count them. Trying to figure out how long to keep bracing yourself. When I finally get to talking about the comfort of shame, you'll know we're done. Yeah. Out of the frying pan into the fire is what that's called. So, we engage in all or nothing thinking. If anything is less than a stunning success, it's a miserable failure. And like I said, essentially we kind of choose for other people whether or not they should accept us because of the flaws that we see. Obviously, we have a longer list of flaws than people know. The interesting thing about it is that one of the 12 steps in AA talks about dealing with our shortcomings and flaws openly. And it doesn't even mention at all about shame. But it really is a foundational point to come to grips with the reality of who we are as humans and living as humans. Not living. See, the interesting thing, and I don't know if one of you guys wrote it or somebody wrote it yesterday. It all melds together. But when we're told to be like Christ, It does not mean that we have to be perfect like him, because I think everybody knows we can't be. And we have other verses where God, and some of the, even within the Mosaic law, that talks about being perfect, and Jesus says this, being perfect as your Father is perfect. You know what that means, right? It's not perfect as in perfectionism. It means being complete or being mature. So growing into maturity is perfect by that standard. Because of our own issues about perfectionism, we turn it into a rationalization that that's why I should be this way. And that's a key point to keep in mind. So the surface flaws, the things that people notice, I say something wrong, you know, I don't, my tongue gets tied and I don't say something, and suddenly I go back and replay the film and say, that was stupid. I mean, why can't you say something simple? And quite honestly, in the world that I live in, where I'm talking all the time, I do that on a regular basis, and I keep having to remind myself that nobody's probably going to remember, but I will always remember when I look at it. And inevitably, it seems to attack me the most on Monday morning. When I get up to speak for the first time, I haven't been talking to many people at all, you know, since Friday. And then I get up and it's like I can't put one word in front of another, and I don't know what a verb or a noun or anything is, it seems like. And I'm just praying that I'm semi-coherent. But I can't use that. I can, and I have. I can't necessarily use that as evidence of the fact that I'm an abject failure. But that's how this thinking tends to go. So, and this goes to the same point of the idea of our goodness can't compare, take note of that, compare to Jesus' goodness, therefore our goodness means nothing. Brian, my friend that I mentioned to you, wrote a book that I think is probably one of the better books written on the humanity of Jesus. It was called Sneezing Jesus. Yeah, Brian's just weird. But he managed to thread the needle between the deity of Jesus and the humanity of Jesus, and talking about that in light of what does that mean for us as humans. And it really marks, Brian would be the first one to tell you that it marks really the point on his own journey of grappling with being human and what does it mean to live as human rather than live as by the standard of Jesus. And the one thing I mentioned, and Brian says it in the book in so many words, is that Jesus was the first person to roam the earth since Adam to be what defined normal humanity. Because Adam without sin was normal humanity. And Jesus came and did exactly the same thing. That's how humanity was supposed to be. It was supposed to be that way. And we think we're so normal. And we're constantly searching for normal when it comes right down to it. So, here's another one. Judge themselves by some undefined ideal. Even being Christ-like sometimes can be an undefined ideal. But when we look at it and talk about it, it's dogged by this unrelenting but unspecified obligation to be perfect. And it's never specified. If I were to take somebody and say, all right, so whatever you do is never good enough, because that's where we started. So tell me specifically what would be good enough. Specifically, not in vague terms, not in generalized terms or anything like that. Tell me what would be specific. And when we start writing that stuff down, we begin to realize the unrealistic, ruthless nature of our ideals that we hold. But I think and this goes back to that same issue we were talking about a minute ago, is this terror that is built in the Christian mindset of pride. And I'm not saying pride's good. I am not making a case for that at all. But I am making a case for the opposite is not the correction. Self-loathing, self-deprecation is not the correction to pride. Actually, in a lot of cases, what's described is, and some people have speculated, what was it that made Jesus so magnetic? You know, why did people flock around him? And we talked a little bit about this, that Jesus seemed to have the penchant for liking to be around real people rather than good people. But I think there's something about his character that was magnetic in the sense that he knew fully who he was. Nobody was really going to undermine his authority. Nobody was really going to get him to think and feel shame over things at all. And we gravitate to people like that. Why? Because they're like what we want to be. So we kind of hang out with them. The funny thing about it is that the only people that were doing that were the people that couldn't hide their brokenness. The people who were broken and hiding it so well didn't hang out with him. So, judging themselves by undefined ideals. And another one is that we read our shame into others' perceptions of us. Now, there's a lot of things that Sigmund Freud did not get right. A lot. But one thing he was dead on, and it was the concept of projection. And that's what we're talking about here, is we take our inner shame and then we read into people's responses to us through that filter. We assume people have that same negative feeling that we do about ourselves. And we always have this card that we can play, and then that is, somebody says, and again, this comes up in intimate relationships and friendships and other things, that somebody says, I'm with you through thick and thin, I am your friend, I am not going anywhere, and some tiny little voice in the back of our head says, yeah, but if you knew me the way I know me, you wouldn't be saying that. So, you can go on saying, it's really patronizing, you can go on saying that and be deluded, because after all, you don't know me the way I know me. So, all of their perceptions, all of their vigilance is directed toward parsing what people are saying and their facial expressions, and ultimately just to confirm their assumptions about themselves. See, a lot of times our reactions to other people say more about us than they do about the person we're reacting to. And we oftentimes just don't see that, and that I get it entirely. But Freud knew, and like I said, he got a lot of things wrong, but some of the defense mechanisms he talks about actually are really right on the money, and projection's one of them. Repression is too. How we tend to shove things down and keep them under wraps, so to speak. The funny thing about that is it always leaks into the water table in one fashion or another. I told you guys the story of Love's Canal, didn't I? Yeah, okay. Has everybody heard it? Okay. And it's the same idea. It really is we shove it down and say, oh, it's not there, it's fine. But then it leaks into the water table, and we get reactive, and we start getting sarcastic, and we complain a lot and do all sorts of things, partly because the anger is just percolating its way out into other things. So they only see in others what they feel about themselves, and they interpret the perceptions of others as far as that's concerned. So, there's hardly any person, I mean, if you guys remember from Eidelman's book, and he went to the recovery meeting, everybody held up their hands if it applied to them. I think probably all of us would have our hands up for at least 90% of these. But remember, none of us are one of these things. None of us are one. purely, and a lot of times these interchange depending on the situation and the scenario we're in. And that's part of the just fighting off the whole domain of shame. The other thing, remember what I said when we were talking about this. Why is it so hard to deal with shame? Because we don't have a vocabulary for it. We don't have words to frame it, okay? So the last thing I want to mention, and then next week we're going to tackle what's new, some really new stuff. But I want to end with why I chose the comfort of shame. Why is it so comfortable? Because it's predictable. I know how to work in a universe that is legalistic and law/rule based. If then, therefore. So it is always predictable. I read one person say basically, I like shame because it can be earned, or the things that I can do, I can earn. And we don't like gifts because it makes us indebted. And it doesn't matter who we're indebted to. It really doesn't. We say it does, but it doesn't, because I don't like feeling indebted to somebody, because then I have to do something when they ask me to do it. See, this is why our relationship with God gets so twisted. Because we hate being indebted, and then if we feel like God's calling us somewhere, we have to do it. And at no point in time does God interact with us with anything other than grace and freedom. But because we turn it into a law-based thing, then resentment grows and trust wanes entirely. So it's predictable, it's known, it's expected. In a lot of cases, the way I put it is that if somebody does something wrong, then somebody needs to be punished. Punishment is required for changing behavior. And you watch people in recovery programs and everywhere else, and when we set about to change our behavior, what is our first tendency to do that, to accomplish that? Usually, it's when I do it, I make myself pay. And what is the weapon of choice? Shame. And that's why people stay stuck in shame. So if somebody's done something wrong, somebody needs to be punished, and that person usually is me. And I will find ways to do that. I can isolate. I can pick a fight with somebody so they don't like me anymore. I can do all manner of things to in a sense, get myself punished. I don't have to do it directly to myself. Now, you guys know plenty of people and been around enough people to know people do that. It's called self-harm. If somebody does something wrong, somebody needs to be punished. And it's all law. There's not an ounce of grace in any of that. And it resonates with something we already believe. And believe is not what is spoken belief, it's behavioral belief. In other words, my conduct betrays what I really believe. And then it creates this false illusion of controlling behaviors and controlling outcomes. That's why it's so comfortable. And we hate it, but we find it pretty comfortable because it makes the world a place of predictability and order and everything else. So, talk to me. What's going through people's heads? I don't know if it's glazed over or shamed over. Any reactions or questions? Yeah.
I guess just like, yeah, like there's like so much that I'm recognizing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of like things rushing over. And right now, I'm probably not like that. Like, what do you even do with that? Like, that's a lot to do.
Yes. And I had somebody really go off on me on a journal in regards to that, who got understandably irritated because I'm not telling you enough to what you can do now. So I just leave you in this state of abject shame. And my answer was, it's coming. I mean, hang in there, Abby. It's not that bad. I got two Abbies sitting right back to you, and you both do the same thing. Yeah, right. Don't pick on me, anything but that. Yeah, never mind. The way this is lining out is it gets worse before it gets better. Which all the best counselors will say that to you. If they don't, they're not being very good. Because it does get worse before it gets better. All I can ask is you just be patient and hang with me through this stuff. Because now that we've done this, all right, I've set the foundation. I've made a lot of people really uncomfortable. I know I have. But a lot of times we have to break some things free, and that never feels good, ever. But once we do that, we can start reconstruction. We can re-engage this process in a little bit different way. What's coming next? Some of you have heard a very shortened version of it, of the stained glass self. That will lead us then into, how do I become pure glass? How do I become known? What kind of life do I lead that's an integrated life? And there's a way to do that. It's not quick and easy 12 steps. I will never give you that. But I will be talking about, so what kind of life do you want to lead? And what kind of life in relationship do you want to lead? And then go out and give it your best shot. Not the perfect shot or the right shot, just the best shot. That's fine. Even half best would do. Because if you can figure out a way to live graciously with yourself, then a lot of things come into focus. A lot of things come into focus, like forgiveness, for example. It comes into focus. Or dealing with this issue of control that I always harass people about. Or the issue of boundaries. Or conflict. See, this thing of grace fits together, and this is an epiphany I had over the weekend, because I talk about the 6 dimensions of redemptive relationships. And some of you guys have been in family psych to hear that. And if you come into my office, I have a little pyramid that somebody made for me that has all 6 dimensions on it. It occurred to me over the weekend as I've been working and thinking about this stuff, is the connective tissue of redemptive relationships is grace. What keeps stained glass in place is shame. And I'll explain that more fully next week. Because it's an important concept for you to understand. So I know that it's uncomfortable. I understand that. All I can ask is just your trust to hang with me long enough to start seeing some of the pieces fall into place as we get past midterm and everything else. So, other questions, comments, anything else? Okay. Love you later. Bye.